Hi, this is Matt with LSAT Cracked. In this lesson, we're going to discuss how to do a main conclusion question stem. It's one of the more conceptually straightforward question stems. They're simply giving you an argument and they're asking you what was the main conclusion of the argument. Now, we've already built a lot of our conclusion finding skills earlier in the course, and that's going to come in handy on this type of question stem, obviously. Let's go over the few things they can do to make finding the main conclusion harder. After all, they're going to make it at least a little bit challenging, or it wouldn't be worth one LSAT point asking you to locate the main conclusion. So the first thing they can do is they can omit using a structural indicator. In fact, when you think about it, it's not going to be as simple as premise 1, premise 2, thus conclusion. That would be way too easy. So you're going to notice a significant percentage of these don't give you a structural indicator for the conclusion. Or they might for a conclusion at the very end of the argument, but maybe there was another conclusion earlier in the argument, and we'll come to that in a moment. So just be aware that you may have to identify the conclusion without a structural indicator for either the conclusion or the premise. Refer back earlier in the course to where we discussed the 4 general categories that those types of conclusions generally tend to fall in, so that you can be aware of how they might be supporting it later in the argument. Oftentimes the conclusion will be the first sentence of those arguments where an indicator is not used. Let's think about another thing they can do. They could potentially require you to synthesize 2 sentences in order to form the conclusion. Some people claim that aliens are the ones who built the pyramids, period. This is ludicrous, period. And then the argument goes on to explain why we have definitive proof that the Egyptians built the pyramids and no evidence that aliens ever visited the earth during that time period. The conclusion is this is ludicrous, but this is obviously just a pronoun placeholder referring back to the previous claim. So in order to get that answer choice correct, in order to find the main conclusion of that argument, you need to be able to say the claim that aliens built the pyramids is ludicrous. That's how you do that problem. Finally, the third thing they can do to make it difficult is to give you 2 conclusions. This is pretty straightforward though. You identify the fact that there are 2 conclusions and you pause. Say, okay, don't just move on. Demand that you tell yourself which one is the main conclusion. And there's a very simple logical test for determining which one is the main and which one is the intermediate conclusion. The intermediate conclusion, if true, will support the main conclusion being true. The main conclusion, if true, does not necessarily support the intermediate conclusion being true. So if you were looking at 2 conclusions and one of them was, thus all dogs are black, and another conclusion in your argument was, therefore, this dog on my front lawn is black. You'd ask yourself, okay, which one of those, if it were true, would support the other one being true? Well, if the dog on my lawn is black, it doesn't necessarily support the claim that all dogs are black. But if it were true that all dogs are black, if that were true, it would support the claim that some dogs are black, or this particular dog on my front lawn is black. So in that case, oddly, counterintuitively to some people, the all statement actually ends up being the intermediate conclusion. It in turn supports the more sort of hedged and specific, therefore this particular dog is black. People make a mistake of thinking that the main conclusion is something like the main takeaway or the moral of the story or the theme that you're supposed to draw from the argument. No, that's fuzzy, that's not analytically precise, and that's going to steer you the wrong direction half the time. Simply ask the following question. If the intermediate conclusion is true, does it support the main conclusion? If the answer is yes, you're on to the right way of thinking about it. If the answer is no, try it the other way. Say, well, if this conclusion were true, would it support that conclusion? It's all about realizing the main conclusion is lazy. It does not support anything. It receives support from the intermediate conclusion. You keep these things in mind, be able to deal with arguments where they do not give you structural indicators for the conclusion. practice synthesizing when our argument responds to an opposing position, and hone your skills on two conclusion stimuli where you focus on identifying the intermediate conclusion from the main conclusion, and you'll have completely covered the bases for dominating main conclusion question stems.